Okay, so this topic we started last week, and I promised a continuation, but of course we have to recap. So the final mitzvah in the Torah, mitzvah number 613, recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 31, that it is incumbent upon every individual to write a Sefer Torah. Now write this song for yourselves. Teach it to the Jewish people. Place it in their mouth. So that this song should be as a testimony for the Jewish people. So there are a number of important things to address over here. Sorry, I just got distracted. Sean, please. Hashem, in the new building we'll have classrooms, designated classrooms, and then we won't have these issues. Anyway, so the first thing that's obvious is where it says to write the song. What is the song, and how does this mean that there's a mitzvah for every individual to write the Sefer Torah? So again, I'm just going to recap. Last week we spoke a number of ways to understand this, but basically there were two approaches. One approach was that Shira refers to the Shiras Hazinu. This verse appears at the end of chapter 31, or middle of chapter 31, and it leads into chapter 32. Chapter 32 is the Song of Hazinu, which is a song not because it's a very happy content. On the contrary, it's sort of warning of all the calamities that will happen if we do not follow the Torah. That this will be testimony to us that if we neglect to fulfill our responsibilities, there will be repercussions. But the reason it's called a song is because it's poetic. It's written in an unusual language, and it's very poetic. And the commentaries delve into there's all different opinions of how to understand it and the meaning, because that's the nature of poetry, is that it's not explicit. Additionally, it's said, the Friedrich Rabbi said, if people would know the potency of knowing this song properly, everybody would know it. There are actually people who say it every day by heart. There's this famous story with the Ramban that everybody is every Jew, their destiny is, or their name or their destiny or something about them is alluded to in this song. And there's a famous story with a student of the Ramban by the name of Avner, who was so appalled by this suggestion that this triggered him to go OTD, off the derech. But then later on, the Ramban showed him where his life was alluded to in the song. So one approach is to say that when Hashem commands to write the song, what it means is to write Shiras Hazinu, to write Deuteronomy chapter 32. The problem is that there is a prohibition against writing portions of Torah. You can't write a portion of the Torah. Now we're not talking about printing in a book. We're talking about writing on parchment with that was the type of writing that was around. Yeah, you're not allowed to write a part of the Torah. You can only write the whole Torah. So you have to. Oh, very good. So two people asked this question. The Chassam Sofer, who was a very prominent 19th century, or maybe even 18th century posek, and also Steve Edelmuth. They both asked the same question, but I'll get there in a minute.
My great.
So you're not allowed to write a portion of the Torah. So the Torah tells you got to get your Gemara thinking on. The Torah tells you have to write Deuteronomy 32. In order to write Deuteronomy 32, you have to write the whole Torah. That's one approach. Now, there's a number of problems with this approach. One of the problems is, like Steve just mentioned, that what do you mean? The Torah, you're not allowed to write portions of the Torah, but if the Torah itself tells you to write a portion of the Torah, such as write tefillin, write a mezuzah, write the portion of the sota. When there was a sota woman being given the drink in the Beis Hamikdash, she would have to. It would write down the. What is it? Numbers chapter. I don't know, 5 or 6, something like that. Maybe 4. Probably 5. So clearly there are exceptions to the rule. So if the Torah is telling you to write the song of Hazinu, then that would be exception to the rule. So there's 2 ways you could go with this question. Either you could say, well, actually, let's go to the other approach of how does Shira mean the whole Torah? But one way of reconciling these questions is that you're not allowed to. Why are you not allowed to write portions of the Torah? Because a lot of the way we understand Torah is from context. A lot of what we understand in Torah is from context. And if you know, for example, we say in the morning the 13 principles through which the Torah is expounded. We have klal prat, prat klal, when there's first a generic and then a specific, or you have dav v'shahoyu b'chlal v'yotzum min haklal. A lot of these things are based on context, based on the way the Torah, the context that it's coming in. That's how we understand it, and that's how we interpret it. So when it comes to tefillin and mezuzahs, nobody's learning Torah from the tefillin and the mezuzahs. They become sealed, they're closed up, and that's it. Nobody ever reads them. And similarly with the Parsha of Sota, which is written and then it's erased into the cup of water and she drinks it. Whereas here the Torah specifically says, why should you write this song? Teach it to the Jewish people. And like we'll see soon, one of the reasons for this mitzvah is so that Torah is available to study. So if you were to have Torah available to study without having the whole context, then that would be a problem. Now, another way to answer this question is like this, and I'll preface this with another question. The Rebbe, in 1981, the Rebbe initiated the campaign of the children's Sefer Torah and later also adult Sefer Torah, where people should buy a letter in the Sefer Torah, which was a novel concept at the time. Today it's become very popular, many people do this, but at the time it was a novel concept, and in the subsequent approximately a year throughout the rest of this was around Pesach time of 1981, and through the end of 1981 and even the beginning of 1982, the Rebbe discussed things to do with Sefer Torah numerous times. Not just, in other words, that was sort of the springboard, and the Rebbe discussed numerous things. So one of the things the Rebbe says is, I don't understand, Moses is talking to the Jewish people, telling them to write the Torah. This is towards the end, the last few days of Moses' life, if not the last day, right? He passes on the 7th of Adar. After the 7th, and this is Deuteronomy begins less than 40 days before he dies, on the 1st of Shvat. So he's talking to them for less than 40 days, and this is towards the end of his speech. So this is right the last few days. After Moses dies, there's 30 days of mourning, which brings you till the 7th of Nisan. And on the 10th of Nisan, they cross the Jordan into Israel. So, when did every Jew have time? When did they all have time to write Sefer Torah? You know how many parchments you have to procure, and so that's one of the questions the Rebbe asks. And let me just look it up. I think it might actually say, might even be some more to it. So, one approach that the Rebbe suggests is that Torah Megillah Nitna. That means there is one, again, like most things, there's 2 opinions, but one understanding of the process of the giving of the Torah was that at Sinai Moses wrote from Bereshis until to date, right? Until Pashas Yisrael, Exodus, Parakas Yisrael. 19, 20. So 18 maybe. Anyway, so nobody's even checking up if I'm on target. So I could just be bragging. There's a chumash right behind you, and nobody's going to know.
We trust you.
I don't trust myself. I'm just making it up.
Yes.
So over there, so Moses wrote until then, and then as time progressed, as they spent the 40 years in the desert, Moses continued
Journaling.
20. 10 Commandments are in Exodus 20. Moses continued writing piece by piece. And of course, the concept of writing wasn't new then, already from when Moses came down from Sinai. He says, whatever I tell you now is divided into two categories. There's Torah Shebichsav, the written Torah, and Torah Shebapeh, the oral Torah. What do you think you're supposed to do with written Torah? You're supposed to write it. So everybody kept their notebooks. Everybody was writing the Torah as they went along. And therefore, at the end, when Moses tells them, okay, write the Torah, what do they have to do? They just have to finish the last 2 chapters. That's not such a big deal. Now, based on this logic, the Torah Tamima, of course, the Torah Tamima, of course, doesn't quote the Rebbe. The Rebbe doesn't quote the Torah Tamima either. I don't think. But the Torah Tamima suggests, and it could be that Ksava Kabbalah also suggests this. Anyway, the suggestion is made. Why does the Torah say, write this song? Why not write the Torah? The answer is, they've already written the whole Torah. They just have to write the song, and then the last few verses of V'zos HaBracha, and then they've written the whole Torah, because they already have from Bereshis until the song. So when you say, write the song, and Chazal say that means that there's a mitzvah incumbent upon everybody to write the whole Torah, it doesn't just mean because, you have to write the song, but you're not allowed to write the song without writing the whole Torah. No, the rest of the Torah is already written. And you just have to write the song and thereby complete the Torah.
Is it possible because it was called a song, they didn't think it was part of the Torah, and therefore they needed explicit instructions? Like, this is part of Torah, it's not just a song.
That's an interesting idea. I don't recall, first of all, even if I never saw that idea, it's an interesting idea and it could be a thing. I don't recall, it's possible, it is ringing a bell, so it's possible that somebody already suggests that. But there's definitely something similar, which is interesting that I didn't research this, but the Chassam Sofer, who I mentioned before, and Ksava Kabbalah. Ksava Kabbalah was Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg.
We believe you again.
Who, it'd be interesting to check up if he ever, it was possible for him to meet the Chassam Sofer, or, who was not so good with the years. But Rabbi Yaakov Mecklenburg has a fascinating commentary on the Chumash, and a big part of his agenda is, as was the agenda of many of the European commentaries of the 18th century, was countering the Bible critics. So a lot of his commentary gets into these type of questions with words or things seem a little bit strange, and he's trying to sort of explain how this is actually a perfectly reasonable way of method of expression. So he gets into this thing with the Shira, and so both Chassam Sofer and him say something which is perhaps along the lines of what you're suggesting, that imagine if the doctor gives you a recipe to make a medicine, and you have to put, Steve, it's probably not so easy. There's a lot of details, and it has to be done right. So you better write down everything the doctor says. This is before they have drugstores and he just writes a code that the pharmacist knows, right? You have to get all the details in, and you have to go home and find the right herbs and cook it, and right. So you're going to write down all the thing. And then the doctor tells you, you better make sure to do this medicine right and take it every day on time, because if you don't, you will die. Right? Now he says, imagine the guy comes home and he writes himself down on a piece of paper, I have to take this medicine every day or else I'll die, but he doesn't actually write the recipe or the instructions. So he says, what is the Song of Hazinu? The Song of Hazinu, as is the introduction which we're discussing now, Deuteronomy 31. Look at it. What is it all about? You better remember to keep the Torah. You better keep this, every word of it, because every word is important to God. And if you don't do it, lightning will strike. It's harsh stuff, but that's what it is. So he says, when the doctor tells you, write this down for yourself. Write down what I'm telling you, that if you don't do this, you will die. Right? The doctor doesn't have to also tell you and write down the ingredients. That goes without saying. If this Torah is telling you, I want you to remember Shiras Hazinu, and that you should write it down so that you remember it, then obviously he also means that you should write the whole Torah. So, along the lines of what you were saying was, obviously you have to write the whole Torah. The Chiddush is that you also have to write the Song of Hazinu. So that's a second approach to this mitzvah. And finally, the other approach is also suggested by both Chassam Sofer and the Ksava Kabbalah and others, that actually Shira doesn't mean the Song of Hazinu. The whole Torah is called a song, and we discussed this last week. Why would the whole Torah be a song? And one of the ideas is how in music every note and every last detail is of significance to the whole picture, etc., etc. But for various reasons, and we find numerous verses which refer to the Torah as a song. We have in Psalm 119 where David says, your song was your Torah was like your statutes are like a song to me. We have in the Chabad Siddur we say before Ma'ariv the verse of Alaylo Shiroi Imi, that at night his song is with me. His song refers to the Torah, that we study Torah at night. And so Kisul Lechem as Shira means write the whole Torah, so we don't need to get into all these complicated things. Shira means Torah. Okay. So now the question, you want to ask something? Now the question is, so we have a mitzvah to write the whole Torah, but history has shown, right, we don't need to be not many people write the Torah themselves. So how could it be that one of the 630 mitzvahs, and we know that the Rebbe spoke many times how the Rambam codifies what's Mashiach all about. Mashiach is here to reinstate all the mitzvahs that we can't do without Mashiach, right? The mitzvahs that are connected to the Beis HaMikdash, etc. So clearly, we have 630 mitzvahs, and every one of them important, like we just said, music, right? So how could it be that so many people throughout the generations have very devout, holy people, but we don't find that people should do this mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah?
They pay Yochanan.
Well, I mean, I clearly could not write a kosher Torah. So is it that you just write the letters, or does it have to be written in a kosher way such that it can be used in a shul?
Now, before you say that,
You pay someone
if
to
in the
write it.
beginning of your life you were trained to do it, because you knew you would have to do it, you could write it. So saying that you can't write it now doesn't seem a reasonable exemption.
Except I'm about to, though.
It doesn't make any difference. You could
Wait,
start now.
well, how many
And
It
with
gets me out of
effort.
so much.
How many people in Chicago do you know how to write a Sefer Torah? A half a handful?
Right, but that's the
The
point.
whole
But if there's
Chicago?
also the matter of the Kavanah. I mean, there's a
Okay.
Yeah, but
lot.
also, you could have started, everybody when they started, they would say, okay, at this point you're going to have to end up writing the whole one. So you would learn all the other things you'd learn how to do it properly.
The fact is, nobody in history is.
I don't
I'm
understand,
just saying,
Steve.
but
My
that's not
wife's
in
Steve,
cousin wrote
if
his
go-
own Sefer Torah. He wrote a Megillah Esther.
He's amazing.
Steve, if God would come to you now and say, Steve, I would like you to write a Sefer Torah, what do you think you would do?
Do a lot of studying and praying before I started.
I think you would quit your job and devote your whole life to learning how to become a sofer and writing a Sefer Torah. It might take you 5 years of full-time work, but that's what you would do, right?
Depends how much God would pay. If it's more than what he's currently earning.
He didn't write the Sefer Torah until he
So,
retired. Oh, no.
as luck would have it, so this is a question that has perplexed scholars throughout the generations, and I'm going to suggest to you a number of different approaches, including, like I said, in that year of 81, the Rebbe spoke about this numerous times, and the Rebbe also made various suggestions, and hopefully we'll touch upon them. So, but the first
I'm
thing,
attacking you.
Oh, I didn't take it as an attack.
the first basic thing is, before we get into any lumdus, is that, like with many mitzvahs, so for example, sometimes you might make kiddush. Well, it's not the best example, but I'll start there.
Okay.
Sometimes you make kiddush. Sorry,
Or the Kohen Gadol doing things for.
no, but that's not my mitzvah,
Oh.
right? You have a chiyuv to make kiddush, but sometimes you don't make kiddush. Sometimes you yotze kiddush from somebody else. Now, so when you yotze from somebody else, it's not the same necessarily as making an agent, because there we're including the principle of shemea ko'ena, that when you hear something, it's as if you said it. But many mitzvahs that we have, there is the concept of making an agent. So last week we gave the example of Kiddushin, that strictly speaking, you don't have to go to your chuppah, you can send an agent to betroth the woman on your behalf. And numerous other examples like that, where you could make a shliach to do something on your behalf. So the same is true with when it comes to writing a Sefer Torah, that if you don't know how to write a Sefer Torah, so then you don't need to bother. You could just hire Yochanan to write the Sefer Torah for you. And even though usually we say mitzvah bo yosem b'shluchai, that it's always preferable to do the mitzvah yourself rather than make an agent, which is why most people do show up to their own weddings. One of the reasons, but here would be an exception, because why? What's the logic? Why do we always say it's better to do the mitzvah yourself than to make an agent to do it? Right? You have a mitzvah to tithe your produce, so you could either go down to your field and take the tithes, or you could send your worker out there to do it on your behalf. Why would it be better to do it yourself?
Because then you know it's being done properly.
No, it's a
You can
direct,
supervise it.
it's direct doing
It's your
rather
mitzvah.
than indirect.
Yeah, what?
Oh yeah, that's the mitzvah. We own it.
Right.
We've invested
To
in
show
it.
your dedication to the mitzvah, and with your appreciation and love for God and love of the mitzvahs, you want to do it yourself. Like, Abraham harnesses his donkey himself, and that, right? So don't just get someone to do it for you, do it yourself. So the idea is we prefer that you do it yourself to show you're cherishing the mitzvah. So when the Rabbi discussed, the Rabbi said, sometimes the way you cherish the mitzvah is by getting somebody else to do it. Because, yes, I could learn how to become a sofer and write it myself. But somebody else who's more artistic than me, if I'm going to hire him to do it on my behalf, that would be a more beautiful Sefer Torah. So, in this case, it's topsy-turvy. That the way I would show that I cherish the mitzvah is precisely by not doing it myself and hiring an agent to do it. And perhaps a similar, the Rabbi doesn't say this, but I think a similar example to this would be the mitzvah of circumcision, right? Where it's the mitzvah upon the father of the child to circumcise his son. Most people do not do the mitzvah themselves. They appoint an agent in the form of a moel to do it for them. But okay, then there's also medical considerations, but and there are people, I mentioned last week, there are people who do that mitzvah themselves because they just get the moel to set it up, and to just do the actual act of the mitzvah once the moel has set it up doesn't take all that much talent. But nevertheless, I think that getting a moel to do it for you, on the contrary, like, I want to do this mitzvah in the best possible way with causing the least discomfort to the baby, etc., etc. My way of cherishing the mitzvah is by appointing an agent, the moel, to do it for me. So that's the first stage, but the problem is that most people don't appoint an agent to write a Sefer Torah for them either. And I'll just like to emphasize that buying a Sefer Torah doesn't mean that doesn't work. You can't just buy a Sefer Torah. You have to appoint an agent, just like you can't, like any mitzvah has to be done with all the criteria of a mitzvah. There has to be kavanah, you have to intend, right? You can't just find a Sefer Torah and pay for it and say, oh, no, you have to hire somebody will do it for you for free, that's fine, but you have to appoint somebody to write it for you. Now, then the next thing that the Rambam says is that it's even if a person is magia one letter of a Sefer Torah, it's as if he has written it. So there's different ways of understanding what this means. One way of understanding it is that you have a Sefer Torah which is not kosher, because there's a letter missing, or there's a letter that's puzzle, that's touching the letter next to it, whatever, various things that could make a letter puzzle. And if you fix that Sefer Torah and render it kosher in so doing, then you fulfill the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah. Another way of understanding it is that it means even if you don't find any mistakes, but just checking the Sefer Torah or fixing a letter, even if it was kosher before you checked it, there's various sort of intricacies in how to understand that. And that is another approach to fulfilling the mitzvah, although perhaps not the ideal way. But again, that's not something that we find that people do. And even the custom that is the custom that we have, that when we do make Achronos Sefer Torah Siyum, then everyone comes and participates in writing the last few letters, it's definitely within the spirit of the mitzvah that everyone participates, etc., etc. But it's difficult to argue that from a legal perspective you fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah by writing that letter, for many reasons. But one reason is the idea is that kol ish v'ish, every individual has to have a Sefer Torah. So 100 people wrote the last letter. So whose Torah is it? Right? And there's numerous other issues with that concept. And like the Rebbe himself emphasized numerous times, that when I'm talking about buying a letter in the Sefer Torah, don't confuse that with fulfilling the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah. You do not fulfill the mitzvah of buying a Sefer Torah by buying a letter. The Rebbe happened to speak about it in that context. It doesn't say this, but from the context, it seems that what happened was that because the Rebbe spoke about it, people often misconstrued things, and then the Rebbe heard it being said in his name that if you buy a letter in the Sefer Torah, you have fulfilled the mitzvah. And the Rebbe said, no, I never said that. Right? You don't fulfill the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah by buying a letter. Buying a letter is a beautiful thing, and you participate, and it's achdus. And I said, one of the interesting things that the final mitzvah of the Torah is a mitzvah that most people can't do themselves, and we'll see soon how we do, what the different approaches to how we do it are. But there's a message here in that if you can't really fulfill the Torah by yourself. In order to be a good Jew and fulfill all the mitzvahs, you can't live in isolation. You have to be part of a community. But we'll get more on that soon. Now, so most people don't write Sefer Torah themselves. Most people don't appoint an agent to do it for them. And most people don't find a Sefer Torah which needs to be fixed and fix it up. And like the Rebbe often said, that it's not just most people don't do it, you would have to do it as soon as you become bar mitzvah, right? As soon as the obligation takes effect, we don't find that people do this.
Isn't that how it used to be? I get the impression nowadays we buy the letter and you have a shliach like Yochanan Nathan writing the last letter. In the past, isn't it used to be where actually each individual, they didn't write the Torah, but they actually wrote the last letter. So from what I've heard, when if you were to check to see if a Torah 100 or 200 years ago was kosher, one of the things you do is you go right to the end, and you'll see if each of the letters were written by somebody else. That makes sense.
You're referring to a story
Outlining the letter, and they would ask people, do you fill it in with the ink?
But you could tell that because everybody would fill it in differently.
Sephardim do it in a different way. I think.
Say, right,
I think the Sephardim, they write the whole letter, and then there's a gap, and you just fill in the gap. There's a story with the Noida Yehuda that there was the Jewish community. The Noida Yehuda was the Rav in Prague. I think he was even related somehow to some Sefer, but I can't. We'll figure this out. The Yehuda was the father-in-law of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger was something with some Sefer. Anyway, but there's definitely some familial something there. I should know history better. Anyway, but so they basically there was a monastery selling a Sefer, came to offer the Jewish community to sell a Sefer Torah, and the community, there were a number of shilas involved, and so how did the monastery get it? But one of the questions was, how do we determine that this is a legit Sefer Torah? And the Noida Yehuda said, roll it to the end and see if you could tell that the last letters are. So that's I believe the story you're referring to.
How would that make it legitimate or illegitimate?
Well, that would be indicative of the fact that it was written by a Jewish community and somehow made its way to the monastery, but not that it was written by some learned Christian priest. Which in those days there were many of the Christian theologians who were very familiar with Hebrew and Jewish law and Talmud, and maybe they were.
So your assumption is that if the last letters are
if they
written
fulfill
differently,
right,
then it's actually kosher.
The Noida Yehuda was saying
one of
that.
the indications. I mean, there's others, right, that you look at.
Of course, yeah. The
But that's
Yehuda
one.
was just saying, like, if you could tell that they fulfilled this minhag, then you know it was written by Jews. Nobody else does that. I don't know if this is printed in his Truvas. This is the story, they say. Now, so So most people are not doing any of these of these mitzvahs, any of these methods of fulfilling this mitzvah. So there's a tshuva from the Shagas. I'll just share a few more approaches. There's a tshuva from the Shagas area where he says,
Is there anyone that says that the printing we have today when you buy a chumash?
yeah, well, I'm going to get there.
Okay.
Um,
Buy a chumash.
The Shagasarya basic. So there's this concept of chaseris v'yaseris that because words in Hebrew there's the vowels are part of the words, yeah. So or the letters. So you could spell the same word in two different ways, right? You could have kadosh spelled kuf daled shin. You could have kadosh spelled kuf daled vav shin. So the Shagasarya says that nowadays we are no longer baki v'chaseris v'yaseris. That means it's evident from certain Gemaras that there are some words which we no longer have 100% certainty that they're supposed to be written in the full way or the how do you say it, the short way, shorthand or elaborate, yeah. And so therefore he says we don't really know if our Sefer Torah are kosher. So he says as far as having Sefer Torah in shul and using them for laning, fine, you learn from a Sefer Torah. It's still true that this is the word of God, and you could make a blessing in it that Hashem gave us His Torah, etc., etc. But as far as the fulfilling the commandment to write the Sefer Torah, well, maybe we've got it all wrong. Maybe there's a few letters in our Torah missing, or maybe there's a few letters that are there that don't belong there.
What's the basis for that?
The basis is it's clear from various Gemaras that they used to have a much stronger. They used to know all the letters exactly, and that nowadays there's some letters that we're not 100%.
So you're saying that different Torahs now may have slightly different spellings?
Today, I don't believe today there's maybe one or two words that there are different spellings on in different communities. One is P'tzua Daka, famous, where the Daka is spelled Dalet Kof Aleph or Dalet Kof Hey. There may be one or two other, with the Taimani communities, things like that. But yeah.
You're saying in general.
But in general,
Maybe
even though we've all got it, we've all got the same. We may have it wrong with,
right.
Even if you have it wrong with one letter.
You passed it down, passed the error down through the. Okay.
The Chidor writes how the Rambam.
Is that what Kriya Ksiv? Does that have anything to do with that?
Possibly.
Similar idea.
The Chidor. The Chidor writes how the Rambam. The Rambam spent excessive, crazy effort to be Magia Sefer Torah. There was a Sefer Torah in Yerushalayim. Let me just find it. Sefer Torah in Yerushalayim, which had a very strong Masorah, and the Rambam spent much time going through it and making sure the Torah that he himself wrote was 100% accurate, and that later on in his life the Rambam found out that there was a there was a Sefer Torah in Egypt, which was, the Rambam himself writes, this is explicit in the Rambam, there was a Sefer Torah in Egypt that was edited, so to speak, got over by Ben Asher. I don't know who Ben Asher is, but clearly he was an important person in this regard. And it used to be in Jerusalem, and then it came into Mitzrayim, and this is the one, the Sefer Torah that the Rambam himself relied on. There is a Tanakh which in many academics is called Kesar Aram Tseva. We don't have most of it. We have still parts of it that would. I mean, you could read up about this. Just Google Kesar Aram Tseva. But many academics hold that this is what the Rambam was talking about, and that this is the most accurate version of the Bible that we have. I'm not even sure if we have Chumash. Do we have Chumash from them? We may or may not, but we definitely don't have the whole 24 books of Scripture. We have parts of it, which were they were in Yemen, and it sort of had its rounds, whatever it was. But anyway, so it could be that that's the Sefer Torah the Rambam is referring to, the Kesar Aram Tseva. But be that as it may, he spent a lot of time editing it, and then he says that he found the Chumash in the handwriting of the Rambam, which. He says the Rambam found out that in the kingdom of Barjona, does anybody know what Barjona is? don't know, in the kingdom of Borjona, there was a Sefer Torah handwritten by Ezra HaSofer. And so the Rambam traveled to this place and found that the Sefer Torah that Ezra had written was exactly the same as the Sefer Torah from Ben Osher that the Rambam had. And then he again made sure to copy it exactly, and he spent tremendous effort on this. And so that's what we consider, the Chidah says that's considered the most accurate. There's also, it's not just about the letters, it's also psuchas and stumas, because when you have paragraphs in the Torah, so there's two types of paragraphs. You can have an open paragraph or a closed paragraph, which basically means, does the next paragraph start on the same line or the next line, the beginning of a line, the middle of a line? I'm sure you noticed when you get in Aliyah, there's different types of breaks in between the paragraphs.
Is that the same as the concept of open and closed?
Yes, yes. Okay, so that's the Shanghai-Saragu's argument. There's a number of problems with the Shanghai-Saragu's argument. The primary problem is that even if there is a chance that we got it wrong, I mean, the principle is that Safik Deraisa L'Chumra, that if there's a biblical mitzvah, so then if in doubt, you have to err on the side of caution. So everyone should have to write a Sefer Torah, because maybe we have it wrong, but maybe we don't have it wrong. Rav Moshe Feinstein uses another trick, so to speak, and he says, based on the principle which Rav Moshe talks about a lot, that the principle is that for negative mitzvah you have to give up all your money not to violate the negative mitzvah. But to fulfill a positive mitzvah, you don't have to spend a tremendous amount of money. Now, I'm not going to get into how you evaluate what a tremendous amount of money is, right? But let's say your only way to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav would be by taking out a mortgage. Then you don't have to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav. If your only way, whatever the scenario would be, if let's say the only way to abstain from eating pork was to get another mortgage, then you would have to get another mortgage. But if your only way, because that's a negative mitzvah, but if your only way to fulfill the mitzvah of lulav, you're on a desert island, there's no Jews and there's no Lovim and there's no import and there's no FedEx, and the only way to do it was to just get a mortgage and then you would be exempt.
Does that say something about the value of a positive mitzvah versus a negative mitzvah? They're different.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not gonna go there now because it's already 9:45. So Rav Moshe says that the reason why most people don't fulfill the mitzvah of Torah is the writing of Torah is because throughout history, including today, usually it would cost a tremendous amount of money, time, effort. Even if you knew how to write, you would have to take a year off work to do it, right? So, because it's such a tremendous cost, so that's why people don't do it, he says.
Yeah, I think we should cancel Pesach. That's a pretty tremendous cost too.
But first of all, Pesach is also a negative mitzvah.
Oh.
It was an idea, though.
The Chinuch says, I mentioned this last week, and Bob is eyeing this book. I could say from the beginning of the class he's been staring at this, he once said. I already told you, the principle of Beis Menachem is if you ask me for a book, either I tell you where it is, or if we don't have it, you have to sponsor it.
I'm not going to ask you where the Torah is.
So the Chinuch is sort of like a code where he has his template. He goes through all the 613 mitzvahs. So at the end of every mitzvah, he says, who does this mitzvah apply to, and how would you fulfill it or violate it? So he says, how would somebody violate this mitzvah of writing in Sefer Torah? If a person, I'll just read to you their translation, this mitzvah applies at every location in all time, so it's not limited to the time of the temple or, like that. Mitzvah applies only to men. One who transgresses this mitzvah and does not write a Sefer Torah for himself, when he is able to do so in any manner, has violated this mitzvah obligation. Now, what does it mean if you're able to do so in any manner? So perhaps one way of understanding it is that we're sort of precluding here that you don't, because it's a positive mitzvah, you don't have to spend you hold on. That's one way of understanding what the chinuch means. That because you have to spend so much money. And again, with this, there are a number of problems. I'll point just to two of them. First of all, there is a question whether or not this dispensation, that you don't have to spend all your money on a positive mitzvah, does it apply to a positive mitzvah that's once in a lifetime? So, for example, if you would have to take out a mortgage to fulfill the mitzvah of circumcision, then possibly you would have to, even though it's a positive mitzvah, because it's a once in a lifetime mitzvah. Let's say, forget about circumcising a child. If an adult wasn't circumcised and he has a mitzvah to circumcise himself, or I'm just thinking another example. I was actually recently speaking to somebody who did not have a pidyon haben because he assumed himself to be a Levi, but we're in the middle of verifying. It's not so clear that he is a Levi. So he's an adult, and he may, we'll see what happens, but perhaps he's going to come to my office one day and we'll have to bring in a kohen and do a pidyon haben. So what if a pidyon haben costs whatever it is? It's the price of silver, but I don't know, somewhere between $90 and $120. Yeah. So what if he doesn't have so much money? So you could say that it's a once in a lifetime mitzvah, so you have to do it anyway. Right. Anyway, the other question is, and this is something which I think in the Rebbe's approach is something that there were many, even though there is this dispensation and you're not obligated to spend more than a hoin rav on a mitzvah, there were many Jews, very devout Baalei Mesiras Nefesh. The Rebbe in one of his talks actually mentioned his own father, who gave not just their every penny, who gave their every life for the minutest nuance, minutia, what's the word, of every mitzvah. So it can't be that all these, not me, but these great tzaddikim throughout history who were Moshe Nefesh for the minutest detail of Torah and mitzvahs, that they didn't do it just because it's too expensive. That doesn't really add up. So the Rebbe has another. There's another approach here, which the Rebbe basically says, in short, that there's a concept of leiv besdin masna aleim, and that is that Bezdin, and we're not talking here about a specific Bezdin, in the CRC. Bezdin is the sort of the institution. It could have been a Bezdin thousands of years ago, and they could have made this, sort of built this into the Constitution, and it's just there, the amendment, sort of, it's there forever. That is, that what's the idea of writing a Sefer Torah? Like, I'm going to get to your thing about books, but what's the idea of the mitzvah? Lamdas b'nei Yisrael, to teach it to the Jewish people. So the mitzvah is that you should learn from the Sefer Torah. So the Rebbe says, Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleim, the Bezdin enacted that every individual Jew, when they get an aliyah in the Sefer Torah, who does the Sefer Torah belong to? It belongs to the tzibur, it belongs to the community. So as a part of the community, when you get an aliyah in the Torah, for the duration of your aliyah, the Sefer Torah belongs to you. And we actually find such a concept in other areas. So, for example, Baruch Hashem, nowadays we're blessed with affluence and transportation and import and export, and everybody has their own lulav and esrog. But it used to be common that every shtetl in Europe, if they were lucky, there was one set of kosher set of arba minim in the town. And who did it belong to? It was and there's many responses written about this, because the halacha is that the lulav has to belong to you, it has to be your own property, at least on the first day, which is we have this whole thing of matana minas lahachzir. So if it belongs to me, I can give it to you as a gift, with the stipulation that you have to afterwards return the gift. But if it belongs to the community, well, who's going to give it to you as a gift? So if it belongs to the community, how could you fulfill this mitzvah? And there's many tshuvas written about this, but basically the upshot of it is that Leiv Bezdin Masna Aleim, that this lulav shall belong to you while you're fulfilling the mitzvah, and to you while you're fulfilling the mitzvah. So this was the Rebbe's suggestion, that the same applies to the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah, that everybody fulfills the Sefer Torah by being part of a community that has one, and periodically getting an aliyah in that Sefer Torah.
That would be an interesting case. In the middle of your aliyah, you run off with the Sefer Torah and you say, it's mine. You have to go to Beis Din and argue that point.
I once had that. I was once putting on film with somebody in Israel. I put on film and he just walked off with my phone. I was like, hey, dude, come back. So, I think he was a little bit, I don't know, he was an interesting dude.
A little bit,
Yeah.
maybe a little more.
I'm not, I don't think he was trying to steal them. I think he was just a little bit,
Distracted.
yeah. He didn't speak, he spoke only Russian. It was a strange encounter. Anyway. Okay, so now, Reb Shalom is asking about Sfarim. So by the way, it's interesting because the Rabbi, the Likkutei Sichos is the Rabbi's edited talks, which are often compiled from various talks. So in Likkutei Sichos, in volume 23 and 24, there are two Sichos about this, which start off with basically the same question: why doesn't everyone write the Sefer Torah? And in both of them, there are two completely different approaches. In the second one, in volume 24, there's the approach that I just said now. Which again, I mean, it's a long thesis and there's a lot of intricate details, but I just gave you the point. That the idea is that when you get an aliyah, it's like you're there. And in the two, there's almost no overlap in between the two, which is somewhat unusual. And this sikha, which is much more complicated, and so I'm not going to get into all the details of this one either, but this one is relating to your point about writing Sfarim. You know, there was a mashpia in Tzfas by the name of Rabbi Lezer Zeitlin, a very special Jew. He passed away unfortunately at a young age. But when I first went to yeshiva in Israel in 2003, so I was at his house for a Shabbos. So we had a big Farbrengen Friday night. And he was telling a story about one time when the Rebbe gave him a packet of 50 single-dollar bills and a bottle of wine, and then he was attacked. It was like some whole miracle he was saying. Anyway, in the middle of the story, a whole new group of people came to join the Farbrengen. So he wanted a break. So he told me, repeat the story heretofore, and then I'll take, why should I, he wanted a break. So I started repeating the story. Now, I was from England, and I wasn't so familiar with the American way of speaking. So he had said that the Rebbe gave him 50 singles. When I repeated the story, I said the Rebbe gave him 50 $1 bills. But I didn't, like, singles wasn't part of my thing, right? It was $1 bills. So with the way he heard it, it was like that I said the Rebbe gave him 51 singles. $51 bills, right? So he says, what? like, how did you even make that mistake? So then we were talking, and then it was like this whole joke. He says, I'll tell you a story. There was once a rumor in town going around that Yankel stole all the Sefer Torah. So the whole town is abuzz, and this was in 2003. It was before smartphones and WhatsApps, but it was Yankel stole all the Sefer Torah. How could it be? I always trusted him, and this guy, and I heard this from a reliable. So anyway, eventually this comes to the Rav, and he calls in, tracks down the rumor, and he says, okay, did you say that Yankel stole all the Sefer Torah? So he said, no, I said that Yankel stole a Sefer Torah. So he says, oh, okay, that's the difference. Who did you hear that from? Chaim. Calls on Chaim. And he says, Chaim, did you say that Yankel stole a Sefer Torah? So he says, no, I never said he stole a Sefer Torah. I said he stole a Sefer. And in Yiddish, you could call a Sefer Torah a Sefer also, or this is a Sefer. Yeah, he stole a Sefer. He says, oh, you said he stole a Sefer. Right, okay, the story's starting to make a little bit more sense here. Unfortunately, I can tell you, this is my I go to therapy for this. People taking books from the library all the time. Right, so he stole the Sefer. So Bob is still eyeing the chinuch. But
I've been noticing that the book was missing for about a week.
So it was on my place, I think. So, because I gave the beginning of this class last week. Anyway, so he says, "Oh, so Yankel stole the Sefer. Where did you hear that from?" He says, "Oh, whatever." Yitzchak tells me. He calls him Yitzchak. He says, "Did you say that Yankel stole the Sefer?" He says, "No. I was at a Sheva Brachos, and Yankel gave a speech, and I told the person next to me that he stole his speech from a Sefer." so anyway, so Rabbi Tzeitlin said, I said 51. Sorry. So are we talking about Sefer Torah or are we talking about Sfarim? So there is a very strange Rosh. And thanks to Bob's book over here, we even have a translation of the Rosh, I think. No, it doesn't translate it, he paraphrases it, and I want to read you the real deal. The Rosh says like this. Oimer Ani, the Rosh is... Rambam, Rif, and Rosh are considered the three primary codifiers of they were the first sort of generation of codifiers, even though of course the Rosh and the Rambam and the Rif were a lot before the Rosh. But for example, the Beis Yosef, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the way he there's exceptions to the rule, but as a rule, the way he decides halacha is that he says we have the three, the Rambam, Rif, and the Rosh, and I follow the majority. So wherever there's two against one, that's how he'll paskin. So the Rosh says, I say that of course there is a tremendous mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah, but that was only true in the earlier generations when they would learn from a Sefer Torah. But nowadays that we write Sefer Torah and we just leave them in the shul to learn from them in public, it is a mitzvah say upon every individual who can afford, again, everyone who can afford it, to write Chumshei Torah, the Pentateuch, also because Pentagon, Pent is 5. Mishnah, Gemara, Perusheim. To write the Mishnah and the Gemara and their commentaries. Lagois Behem, to learn from them regularly, to toil them. Who of one of him and his family, because the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah is to learn it. The Chsev, in the very verse that says to write a Sefer Torah, it says, V'lamdas b'nei Yisrael sima b'fiyam, write it, and to write the Torah and teach it. And like we saw yesterday from the Chinuch, that the reason that we need to all write a Sefer Torah, and that it's not good enough to say, oh, well, I have a Sefer Torah which I bought or I got it as an inheritance. Why do you have to write your own one? Because we want to predicate, what's the word? Proliferate. There should be lots of Sefer Torah in good condition. There should be nice, beautiful books, new prints. We want to have Torah being as accessible as possible. Nobody should say that I can't learn Torah because I don't have a Sefer Torah. Says the Rosh, good. Nowadays, how do you learn Torah? You learn Torah by writing a Chumash, writing a Mishnah, writing a Gemara. Those are the mitzvah. Those are the books that a person is commanded to write, and it has all the rules of a mitzvah of Sefer Torah. Just like you're not allowed to sell a Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to sell your books. That is your fulfillment of the mitzvah of the Sefer Torah. Now, it's a very strange Rosh, because the Rosh is coming to say that the mitzvah in the Torah changes. Like, we don't do that. We're Orthodox, right? We don't just change mitzvahs. So what's going on with this Rosh? How can the mitzvah of the Torah change? Before I continue, the question that I may have addressed, I don't remember how explicitly I addressed this last week, but we were talking about Hey Tevis and the Rebbe encouraging people to buy Sfarim. Now, how do you deal with this? Even if we were to take the Rosh at face value, the mitzvah is to write Sfarim. Has anybody here ever written a Sefer? Nowadays we have a printing press, and we don't even order the Sefer to be printed. The Sefer is already printed in the store, and I'm just ordering it from the store, from Amazon. Remember I said before, you can appoint an agent to write a Sefer Torah for you, but you can't just go and buy a Sefer Torah. He has to be writing it for you on your behalf. So how do we deal with that in an age when Sfarim are all pre-printed and you're just buying them?
It's easier to write a Sefer Torah, because all you have to do is copy what's already there. To write a book, you have to have original thoughts.
No, well, that is true as well. But the Rosh is not saying to write original books. The Rosh is saying to write Chumash, Mishnah, and Gemara, so you could just copy it.
Oh, you can copy.
Yeah, but then you get into copyright issues.
Well, there's no copyright on Chumash, Mishnah, and Gemara by when you write. I mean, if you copy somebody's formatting, then maybe. But
Okay, so when you say write form, it can be it doesn't have to be something original, new, innovative. It can be a copy.
Right, there's definitely value in innovation, and it's another thing which the Rebbe encouraged a lot, that people should write their own Torah thoughts. But so what's the value? So there's an irony that I struggle with, that in an online age where everything's either on the internet, or even if it's not on the internet, it's on a hard drive, which is again digital. How do we deal with with this, and I think that they're both are true. On the one hand, one of the values of the mitzvah here is to make learning accessible, and the more accessible it is, the better. And how many people learn today from the Rabbi Gordon app or the YU Torah Anytime, or that's audio, and even just written things that are articles on different websites, and so that's a tremendous. Help me with this word here. Predication, like similar to proliferate. Sorry.
Proliferation.
No, there's another word similar to proliferate.
Propagate?
Yeah, propagate. Is that the right? What does propagate mean?
Propagate means to spread out.
Right. So this is a tremendous propagation of Torah. But on the other hand, besides the fact that you can't use it on Shabbos, there is a value in the written book, and that part of the value is that it shapes. I mean, like I mentioned last week, the Rabbi made this campaign of having a house full of books. Now, it doesn't mean that your house has to be literally full of books, but the idea is that a home is shaped by what's important to the homeowner. If you're an artist and you have a studio in your home, or a musician and you have a studio in your home, then your home is all and you have everything, but what's the pride and joy of your home is your studio. So the pride and joy of a Jewish home are the Jewish books. And that can't be substituted with a computer. For that you have to have a library. And that should be sort of shape the identity of the home. And different people, again, even in terms of accessibility, personally I could check up things online, but if I'm actually reading something properly, then I have to print it out. Some people can just sit in front of a screen, but for me, I need to, right? But regardless, there is, just in the technical mitzvah of having a written book, even though we're not writing it and it's already pre-ordered, in terms of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, according to the Rosh, there's definitely value in handwritten, tangible, physical books that are not just digital. Now, it's already after 10 o'clock, so I'm not going to go through all the intricacies here, but I will say that whilst it's true that some understand the Rosh at face value, and they say that even though we don't change mitzvahs, here the Torah explicitly says that the reason for the mitzvah is so that you learn, and it used to be that they learned from Torah, and the Gemara talks about how Rabbi Kiva expounded from the tagin, from the crowns on the letters, he expounded halachas. So at a time and an age when Jewish people were doing that, so then the way to learn Torah was from the Sefer Torah. But nowadays the way we learn is from the written Chumash, Gemara, Mishnayos, etc., etc. And some have even pointed out that this is perhaps alluded to in the verse that says, now you should write this Torah. Now, in the year, the year of Moses' death, when there was before the permission to write, to transcribe the oral law, then the fulfillment of the Torah was by writing Hashira Hazois, by writing the Sefer Torah. But that's only now. The time to come, once the writing of the oral law becomes permissible and encouraged, so then the fulfillment of this very mitzvah is through other books. That's one way of understanding the Rosh. I think the normative way of understanding the Rosh, as is in Shulchan Aruch, is that the Rosh is saying that there is still a mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah, but that's not all there is to it. Nowadays, in order to really fulfill the mitzvah, you also have to write Chumash, Mishnayos, Gemara, and other Sfarim, to continue learning from. And whilst it's difficult to say that we actually fulfill this mitzvah by buying printed books, but as I believe, and again I said to you, the other sikha in this book, in Chelik Chav Gimel, is a very difficult sikha, but I think that part of what the Rebbe is saying in that sikha is that ultimately all these sort of technicalities, that it has to be handwritten, and it has to be on parchment, and it has to be with, those are all sort of technicalities so long as the mitzvah is to write a Sefer Torah. As soon as the mitzvah develops into including, again, not like the simple reading of the Rosh, but the normative understanding of the Rosh, that it includes writing other Sfarim, so now it doesn't matter if you write it yourself or if it's printed or if it's, because the idea is to have a tangible written book, and that can be fulfilled either way. I'm expressing caution because, like I said, it's a very complicated sikha and I don't fully understand it. But I believe that is definitely part of the suggestion that the Rebbe is making, that the technicalities of the halacha don't apply you could perhaps fulfill it by buying printed books from the shop, and this is also in support of the Rebbe's campaign of Bayis Malei Sfarim. And additionally, what we said before from the earlier Sikha was that the core of the mitzvah, which is writing an actual Sefer Torah, we fulfill by belonging to a community and having aliyahs on the Sefer Torah from time to time.